My destiny as Dovahkiin still followed me through Skyrim. I ignored the calls of the Greybeards, but still fell a small dragon or two, usually with the help of the local guard. I found myself in Windhelm, the oldest city in Skyrim, that still stood occupied. Only to see typical Nord bigotry in full view with an outlaw, Jarl, who cared little for the dark elves that made their home in his shadow. Nevertheless, I was curious about my brief and former comrade in arms. He quietly welcomed me, although welcomed isn't the right word. I listened to him bicker with his commander and housecarl, Gelmar Stone-Fisted. The two outlined, in their argument, their dream for a Skyrim free of the Empire and of those who would help the Stormcloak cause. But they wouldn't refuse help in their cause, all the allies they could get, but the look in their eyes told me that a new Skyrim would be devoid of elves, or elves. They had a point. The Empire was dying, and had been dying since they were defeated by the Aldmari Dominion. Rats scattering from a sinking ship, but the Nords would fare no better without the outside world. I debated how I could so easily kill this Ulfic Stormcloak, perhaps that evening with an arrow or a slit throat over dinner. But the chance to strike down the likes of General Tullius and the rest of the Imperial dogs could be just as equally pleasing. I cut short his company and sought out the rumor of somebody trying to summon the Dark Brotherhood. I had heard of them from my days in Valenwood, and how they were even more ancient and storied than the Morag Tong. But history hadn't been kind to them, and the last century or so many believed them to have become extinct by their own failures. Since I figured they couldn't answer the Black Sacrament, I'd have a contract that needed fulfilling nonetheless. Oh, sweet mother, send your child unto me, for the sins of the unworthy must be baptized in blood and fear. I remembered reading it in a book in my first few months in Morrowind, but I'd never seen the ritual. And now it was being performed by a mere child. As far as I could tell, he had every bit of flesh and blood and had been chanting, off and on, for days, maybe weeks. Yet somehow I felt like I had heard it dozens, hundreds of times perhaps, like it was written on my soul being born a dark bastard. The contract was simple: kill some hag in an orphanage. I could have killed her with a wooden toothpick, but a contract was a contract. I took the time back in Rift 10 to visit my new friends at the Ragged Flagon. Their business avoided murder, a new task was antithesis to that. The deed was done. Apparently the whole of the orphanage was made all the more happier. My payment was reasonable, so I thought nothing of it. The septims I made from my recent work afforded me some upgrades to Breezehole, the insufferable name given to my new property in Whiterun. I awoke one morning to think I'd see the face of my new housecarl, only to hear the wind beating across the walls of somewhere else. The numbness in my limbs suggested I had been drugged, yet I was alive, and awake and being stared at by a lithe figure in the corner. The Dark Brotherhood was apparently well and alive, with at least one member, and I was told to take one of the 3 lives bound in front of me. I simply took the easiest path and eliminated all 3. For a moment I was tempted to make it for, but this Astrid intrigued me. I decided to take up her invitation. I felt a wonderment that I hadn't felt since I took my first life back in Valenwood. A black door, and I had been given an answer. I heard stories of the black doors that guarded the sanctuaries of the Dark Brotherhood. Thieves and assassins, they had been my companions throughout Morrowind, but here, I no longer felt like the constant outsider. I was now brother to a werewolf, a mad mage, a shadow scale, an insane red guard, and an unchild whose very existence was profane to the eight. And on a forgotten wall, that loud ever-present voice like in Bleak Falls, my Dovahkiin destiny was again thrust into my mind, and my new family stood in silence, perhaps in awe. No threats, no restrictions, and I simply wandered through the cold stone, gravely stench, and darkness. I read through a tome, only to find out its author died of his own curiosity, and was now in the discarded waste of a pet spider. I let out a laugh that seemed to echo through those hollowed halls. I found myself intrigued by the unchild. She caught me staring, more than once, but I had no designs on her form. But she broke the cycle of life and death, and had been for 3 centuries. I found myself in frequent conversation with each member of our brotherhood. They had their own unique lessons to teach, and different ideas on the nature of our work. Nevertheless, their high calling had been replaced by a personal loyalty to Astrid which seemed to have been well earned. These death dealers, for all of their eccentricities, were rather open about themselves, and why shouldn't they be? I was intrigued by our leader, Astrid. Her stories weren't too dissimilar, although I didn't have an uncle who lusted after me, but we all have to start somewhere. I learned the truth behind our origins and why there was such hatred between the Dark Brotherhood and Morag Tong, Siblings split at the hip between zealotry and pragmatism. The Brotherhood gave me space, and didn't care much to what gods I kept, but there were a few questions to where I placed behind the dread Father Sith is. I told them that among the 8 there was only Arcade for me, most of the time, as everything that lived would eventually die. But they remarked that Sith is in oblivion was ever eternal, the only real truth. He was there before, and he would be there after. I rattled off the names of Racine, Mephala, Nocturnu. They didn't disprove, but religion had been more the realm of the Morai Tonglen. In the end, the sound of coin was sacred to the Dark Brotherhood. It left me for much to think about it as I wandered out on my first official contracts. I decided to travel to other holds in Skyrim, and there was no shortage of work for a capable individual. War bandits, a stray werewolf, and some vampires all made for interesting assignments. My reputation started to travel throughout Skyrim, and soon I was meeting with various Jarls, their stewards, and other busybodies of the realm. Racine came to me, and at the time I was an RB, address by which I paid service to for so many years. I realized now that I was more of a plaything rather than a valued servant, but to show off my abilities was a chance I couldn't refuse. I hunted and slaughtered, and soon I had a gift made from the skin of a werewolf. Little did I know that this was just the start of my tenuous relationship with the Daedric princess. I eventually wandered back to the sanctuary, and was amused to see the strange jester wander in the countryside was part of our number. I've never been the biggest fan of bards, jesters, clowns, acrobats, or troubadours, but I found myself somewhat amused by his dealings with Astrid. I was skeptical that this metallic vessel was supposed to contain the true leader of the Dark Brotherhood, the infamous Night Mother. And that an insane clown was her keeper. I thought it might have been another one of Astrid's tests, but she couldn't fake the disdain she had for him. Her paranoia slowly grew, and she was convinced that Cesaro was out to take her sanctuary away from her. Most of the sanctuary were personally loyal to her, but loyalty always hinged on proof of leadership. You must be worthy of something to have it. I kept my true feelings hidden. I wasn't really loyal to anything or anyone, but Cesaro was hysteric about how the Night Mother would choose a new listener, and soon the Dark Brotherhood would flourish once more. I never considered myself a scholar, but I will say the Dark Brotherhood became almost an obsession for me as I tried to piece everything together. A dark and mysterious unchild, be 300 years old, was the best source of information, and she told me of the good old days, so to speak. The land was covered with different Dark Brotherhood sanctuaries, and Bravel had been the sacred crypt of the Night Mother 200 years ago. Her loyalty to the Dark Brotherhood and Night Mother had been supreme in those days. But she also saw the near-total collapse of the Brotherhood, with this sanctuary being the last she knew of. It was a sad and bitter song, and oblivion awaited us all. Eventually, Astrid took me aside and made a plan. She was so sure that Cesaro was conspiring with somebody else in the sanctuary. Her paranoia made her hands shake with fury and clouded her judgment. I started to see the truth. She was a leader of the last sanctuary, and thus she answered to nobody, nor did her brothers and sisters have an alternative to her leadership. I reluctantly agreed to spy on Cesaro to root out his phantom traitor. I imagined he was simply talking to himself, and my action would bear no fruit. I opened that large coffin and was surprised to see some actual remains. So this Night Mother once had a physical form, yet this corpse hadn't been reduced to ash and dust. I listened to the mad clown rant and raved to himself. His frustration was not being chosen, as the listener probably furthered his madness. And then that voice, a voice I had longed for, so many years without her, but not distant this time. She was there with me. She was there urging me onward as I notched my bow, and praising me as I slew those 4 hunters at night. Her voice praised her keeper, then had a tone of sadness that he would not be her listener, that duty would be mine, and I had a great destiny to serve her. She went silent as quickly as she had spoke. The crazed jester was outraged at my presence in her slumbering coffin, but overjoyed as I repeated her words to him. He danced and urged me to join him. I do not dance, and in came Astrid and the rest as she demanded to know what had gone on. The story was repeated for all, so that there was no misunderstanding. I could see her fears in her dark eyes as she berated me, and made it clear she was the mistress of this domain. Nevertheless, I had broken no law, shaken no allegiance, and I granted her request for time to understand the fullness of what had happened. I left the sanctuary and realized Dovahkiin, listener, Thane, hero of Skyrim. I couldn't run away from destiny forever, and for the first time in a long time, I felt fear.